2, 1, 0. Ignition, liftoff.
While we are all joining this event from our own location, we would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri people and the Boonwurrung people of the southeast Kulin Nation. We would like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and to all First Nations communities joining us today.
Welcome everyone from either Australia or overseas to another night at the Observatory. As part of last year's Global Learning Festival, MBO launched a new series of live stream events called A Night at the Observatory that showcased the night sky and objects to be found there. This year, we are again taking part in the Global Learning Festival that is co-hosted by Wyndham and Melton City Councils, together with the members of UNESCO, learning cities and learning communities across the globe. Our 11th stream for you this evening is in relation to multicultural astronomy. I'd now like to give a shout out, as always, to our fabulous crew who are working behind the scenes on Facebook and YouTube tonight. They too play a big part in bringing this production to you. We also have Adam and Jamie, who are the producers for the evening, working behind the scenes. And now I'd like to introduce to you our panelists that will be presenting tonight. Could you please join me, Bridget, Drew, Saskia, Merv, and Jamie. And of course, myself, Petra, who will be your host for this evening. So let's get things underway. And first up for tonight's show is Jamie, familiarising you in ancient astronomy.
Thanks, Petra. All right, so just before we get started today, I just want to make a quick distinction between a couple of key terms. These are going to come in pretty handy throughout this presentation. So different ancient cultures in the world had different beliefs about astronomy. Some were scientific and some were more religious. In a sense, these can be thought of similar to modern day terms like astronomy or astrology. These are probably terms that you've heard before. So what's the difference between them? Well, astronomy is a scientific study of space. So like organizations like NASA and a lot of stuff that we do here at MBO as well is more focused on the scientific approach to the universe. Whereas astrology is the interpretation of various positions and alignments of the celestial bodies as having an effect on human lives. So this is things like your star signs and horoscopes and things like that. So it's important to note that these terms are not interchangeable. So if you're talking with your astronomy friends and you use the word astrology to refer to the scientific study of space, you might find that they're slightly irritated with you. Now, we are by no means saying that astrology isn't worth enjoying. We definitely aren't discouraging you from pursuing that passion if that's what you enjoy doing. I just wanted to bring this up just to purely distinguish the difference between the two terms, because as I said, it's going to come in pretty handy later on. So with that said, let's get on with the fun stuff. So we're going to start with a classic ancient civilization. Everybody knows about this, ancient Egypt. So the ancient Egyptians used the stars to determine various aspects of their life. So, for instance, the first stars told them when the Nile would flood. So when Sirius was the first star to appear above the eastern horizon at dawn, it meant that the Nile was going to flood. And this flood was crucial to civilization being able to flourish and grow and last for as long as it did in ancient Egypt. Apologies, I've done something with my PowerPoint there. And their knowledge of the stars as well, it allowed them to create a 365-day calendar. If that sounds familiar, it's because we use a 365-day calendar today, which is pretty impressive to think that go back 4,000 years ago, the ancient Egyptians had a similar calendar to what we have today. Something else that I find really interesting about ancient Egypt as well is that the pyramids of Giza are actually aligned with the 3 stars in the belt of Orion. Now, it's important to note here that this image is an artist's interpretation. It's not how the stars in the belt of Orion appear in the night sky over the pyramids of Giza. But this just demonstrates the alignment and how they're situated in relation to these stars, which is pretty cool. And something else that archaeologists have found in ancient Egypt as well is these stone circles. This reveals how important astronomy was in prehistoric Egypt, and it was also incredibly important to them in matters of religion. So it was used to determine the date of various festivals. And something else really interesting as well, when an ancient Egyptian king died, he was believed to become a star as his soul rose to the heavens. So this is sort of similar to how people think about reincarnation or their loved ones watching over them from heaven after they pass on, which is pretty remarkable. So we're going to move on to ancient Greece now. So a lot of the names of planets, stars, and constellations that we know today actually come from ancient Greek astronomy. For instance, the term planet comes from the Greek word planetes, which means wanderer. And this is because the Greeks thought that they were wandering stars. Now, we have the planets Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And these are pretty well known to us in Western astronomy, Western Hemisphere astronomy. But the Greeks knew these planets, so they knew Mercury as Hermes, Venus as Aphrodite, Mars as Ares, Jupiter as Zeus, and Saturn as Kronos. And astronomy was so important in ancient Greece that the Pythagoreans placed it among the mathematical arts, which included arithmetic, geometry, and music, which are all pretty important in today's society as well. So at this point, remember how I said I was going to link this back to the difference between astrology and astronomy? So the focus and approach to astronomy between these two cultures can be linked to, so we've got ancient Egypt has a more spiritual or religious focus on astronomy, whereas the Greeks had a more scientific approach. They wanted to know how things worked and why they worked the way they do. So in a sense, we could almost say that Egypt's understandings are like modern day astrology, while the Greeks would be comparable with modern day Western Hemisphere astronomy. Now, we're going to move on to another classic here when it comes to ancient astronomy, the Mayan civilization. Now, as most of you would already know, astronomy was of major importance to the Mayans, and they had a similar focus to the Egyptians, where a lot of their understanding related to acts of the gods or things that the gods wanted to happen and things like that. Now, a lot of the Mayan buildings were actually constructed with astronomical events in mind. So there's this temple in Xochicalco, which is an underground observatory, where there's an opening in the roof. And on the 15th of May and the 29th of July, the sun shines from directly overhead and lights up an illustration on the floor. And these days are of great importance to the Mayan priests, which is pretty cool. And their calendars were incredibly complicated as well, especially for their time. So they actually had 2. There was the long count calendar, which had 365 days, like the ancient Egyptian calendar and like our calendar today. And they had something called the calendar round, which combined the 365-day calendar with the 260-day Tzolk'in cycle. And these cycles align every 52 years. Now, that's another familiar number because we have 52 weeks in our year. So there's some pretty similar numbers in a lot of these ancient astronomy knowledge. Now, I'm just going to briefly sum up what we've had here. So, as we know, different ancient cultures had very different understandings of astronomy. Both the Egyptians and the Mayans had similar ideas that the various astronomical events were the work or desire or both of their gods, while the ancient Greeks had a more scientific approach to astronomy, and a lot of our knowledge and understanding of Western Hemisphere astronomy can be traced back to the ancient Greeks. Now, there are, of course, a lot more fascinating interpretations of our universe out there from those who came before us. Go and have a look for yourself if you have an interest in it. There's so much more out there than what we've talked about tonight. So go and have a look for yourselves. These are just the sources that I used. Their image credits are on or near the images on their respective slides. So have a look through these as a starting point and go off and do your own research. But that's it from me. I hope you enjoy the rest of the night.
Thank you, Jamie. You've presented some interesting historical information about how the ancient cultures interconnected the stars to their everyday lives. Next up is Merv with archaeoastronomy in Ireland.
Good evening, Cosmos fans. Mervyn here, bringing you a little bit of my homeland, ancient Irish astronomy. A little picture here shows a number of megaliths or passage tombs right across the Irish Isle. So let's get stuck in. Initially defined, archaeoastronomy is a study of how people of the past understood the night sky and made use of that knowledge. There are many megaliths around. Most famous is probably Stonehenge. Many are older than Stonehenge, and several in Ireland are still under investigation for their astronomical significance. Sites in Ireland are mostly henges of various types. They're earthen mounds, huge earthen rings, stone rings, standing stones, and portal tombs. And many of these have alignments with the sun's rising at the solstice or equinox, and have stone carvings that we don't really know the true meaning of. That's been lost in time. So, who built these structures in Ireland? Many are before 3000 BC, which places them with the Gaelic inhabitants. Celts came to Ireland about 700 BC, and they were followed by the Romans, Vikings, Normans, etc. The most notable structure from Gaelic times is Newgrange Passage Tomb, built around 3200 BC. It's older than Stonehenge. The entrance passage is aligned with the winter solstice sunrise. This aerial view of Newgrange shows how the standing stones outside the entrance were aligned with the autumn equinox, the winter solstice, and between them the cross quarter. For the Gaels, cross quarters were important festivals between the equinox and solstice. The Gaelic calendar used the sun and the stars to mark these periods, and we'll have a closer look at that. Like many ancient cultures, the Irish observed the whole night sky. They made patterns out of the stars and told stories. They saw animals, people, and objects. The opposite picture here shows the night sky of about 3000 BC. Anyone familiar with the hemisphere might notice that Draco, or the Thurban in the tail of Draco, is the pole star. Imloch was a cross quarter between the winter solstice and the spring equinox. It was the beginning of spring and a great festival. Imloch means lamb's milk and was about when the lambing season began. Traditionally a time of weather prediction. Originally the Gaelic pagan festival associated with the goddess Bridge, associated with Candlemas and Christianity. The sky after sunset of 3000 BC, note that Virgo was rising. It is reckoned that the ancient Celts saw this as the goddess Bridge, carrying flowers and seeds for the spring planting. 40 days after the spring equinox is the Beltane festival. It marks the beginning of summer and the pastoral season when livestock are taken out to pasture. Gaelic Beltane became May Day in later cultures. Special bonfires were lit, and all home fires were doused and relit from that bonfire. Arcturus in Bootes is the brightest star in the northern hemisphere and is directly above the pole star after sunset. Bootes, of course, was known as the herdsman in many cultures. Lunasaw is the cross quarter between the summer solstice and the autumn equinox. It marks the beginning of autumn and the harvest season. It's named after the Celtic god Lau and became Lammas in the Christian faith. A time when you left out picked fruit as an offering for the spirits. Cygnus over the pole star after sunset was a sign that swans would soon return to the area. The ram and the bull were likely seen as a sign to sacrifice an animal for the festival. Pegasus rising was the white horse of the sea god Lar. Lar's white horse gave rise to mariners calling white caps on the waves as white horses. The festival of Samhain, about 40 days after the autumn equinox, marked the end of harvest. The great festival was also the beginning of winter and New Year. Pleiades overhead near midnight meant that spirits roamed the sky. Great bonfires were lit to ward off those evil spirits, the fairies. Open burial mounds allowed the rite of passage for all souls, that's the dead from the past year, so that they could pass to the other world. The 1st of November became All Souls Day, and the 2nd of November became All Saints Day in the Christian calendar. And Cernunnos, the horn god, or the master of the hunt, which we know as Orion, was always giving chase to the evil spirits, the Pleiades. Of the dozens of stone carvings around the Boyne Valley in Ireland, these two caught my eye. The first is of the oldest known solar eclipse, captured about 5,300 years ago. The second image is Curbstone 15 at the North Passage tomb. This one is thought to be a sundial. As mentioned, there's plenty of megalithic sites around Ireland and many examples that need further investigation, something I plan to do and maybe make a presentation one night. In the interim, there's some reading material here. Mythical Ireland, the megaliths.net, so noth.com, so yeah, have a look. And my thanks to Wikimedia Commons and Stellarium for images I've pinched. Thank you.
Thank you, Merv. It's remarkable and fascinating how Gaelic Island used the stars to determine the different seasons and festivals. Now, for a special edition news break brought to you by Saskia.
Hello, my name is Saskia and I am MBO's Diversity Officer. I hope you enjoy our presentation on this special edition news break on diversity and multicultural astronomy. Thank you. Wanda Diaz Merced is a blind astronomer using sonification to see the universe. Sonification is translating batches of data from supernova and solar flares into sound bites. Analyzing the data this way can have more advantages than using the naked eye alone. Tactile astronomy can assist blind and low vision people to understand the night sky. For example, a 3D printed model of the moon with craters is a perfect educational tool for everyone. Tips for communicating with deaf and hard of hearing people. Speak normally, don't exaggerate or slow down your speech. To get the person's attention, stamp your feet, tap their shoulder lightly, wave at them or flick lights on and off. Or learn a bit of basic Auslan. Multicultural Astronomical Associations. Astronomers Without Borders aims to bring the world together through the shared passion of astronomy. The World at Night, or TWAN, is an international fusion of art, science and culture. It features stunning nightscape photos and time-lapse videos of the world's landmarks against celestial attractions.
Okay, and Drew will now give you details about Pleiades across different cultures.
Thank you for that, Petra. Now, we've had a few presentations tonight on Greek astronomy, Egyptian astronomy, and Irish astronomy. And that's all been from the point of view of those cultures. But I'm going to look at things a little bit differently. I'm going to concentrate on the Pleiades, which are a star cluster up near Taurus and Orion. And I'm going to talk about the Pleiades and how they're viewed by a wide range of cultures. So let's get into it. So Greek astronomy was mentioned tonight, and our astronomy as we know it in Western astronomy comes primarily from the ancient Greeks. Now, the Pleiades in Greek mythology are the 7 daughters of the Titan Atlas, who fought against Zeus in the Titanomachy, and as a result, Zeus cursed him to hold up the earth and the heavens, and the ocean of Pleione, after whom the Pleiades are named. And the 7 maidens of the Pleiades are Maia, Electra, Taygete, Solano, Alcyone, Sterope, and Merope. So I've mentioned Atlas, the father of the Pleiades. He features heavily in the Greek myths. Zeus also features heavily, as he always does in the Greek myths. And in some of them, Orion the Hunter also features. Now, there are multiple Greek legends surrounding the Pleiades. In one of them, after Atlas was forced to carry the heavens on his shoulders, Orion began to pursue the Pleiades, and Atlas wasn't able to stop him. So Zeus transformed them first into doves and then into stars to comfort their father. But the constellation of Orion, since he also went up into the stars later, still pursues them across the night sky. According to another tale, all 7 sisters committed suicide because they were so saddened by either the fate of their father, Atlas, or by the loss of their siblings, the Hyades. In turn, Zeus immortalized the sisters by placing them in the sky. So there's a number of Greek myths, and they basically all end with Zeus taking pity on them and putting them up into the sky where we see the Pleiades now. So that's Greek astronomy and the Pleiades. What about elsewhere in the world? Various indigenous American cultures have their own stories about the Pleiades, and I'll talk about a few of those. In some of them, Devil's Tower in Wyoming features, not only in these tales, also in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, if you've seen that movie, but that's beside the point of my presentation. The Kiowa tribe of the Great Plains has a story about the Pleiades. As legend has it, they were moving south for the winter when they camped by a stream where there were many bears. One day, 7 young girls were playing further along the stream when suddenly some of the bears started to chase them. The frightened girls leapt onto a small rock and asked the Great Spirit to protect them. The Great Spirit heard the girls' cries and made the rock grow upwards with almost vertical sides, taking the girls with it and leaving the bears unable to reach them. The bears, however, undaunted, continued to claw away at the rock, leaving deep scratch marks and making it grow even taller, pushing the 7 little girls into the stars. The Lakota tribe also had a legend that linked the origin of the Pleiades to the Devil's Tower, and it also talks about the 7 little girls and how they were placed in the sky. The Seri of northern Mexico had it that these stars are 7 women who are giving birth. The constellation is known as Camargue, which means multiple women. The Western Mono tribe of Sierra Nevada believed the Pleiades represented a group of wives who were excessively fond of eating onions and were thrown out of their homes by angry husbands who couldn't handle the smell. Repenting in their loneliness, the husbands sought out their wives, but in vain. They'd wandered into the sky and become stars. And in a tale attributed to the Wyandot people, 7 singing maidens, daughters of the sun and moon, who live in Skyland, descend to earth and dance with human children. Their father, wrathful at their disobedience, banishes them to another part of the sky. So here we have it, many different indigenous American cultures, and I think you can see a bit of a similarity there. 7 girls, 7 maidens, 7 wives, all up there in that same place in the sky. Now, this could be explainable because the different tribes did have interactions with each other, whether it was trading or fighting or whatever. And it's possible that a little bit of storytelling about the Pleiades got transmitted. But let's now look at Australian Aboriginal cultures. Now, the star dreaming story of the Seven Sisters is one of the most widely distributed ancient stories amongst Aboriginal Australia. The songline for this story covers more than half the width of the continent, from deep in the central desert right out to the western coast. The songline travels through many different language groups, and different sections of the narrative are recognised in different parts of the country. This is pretty amazing. How do you have the same story when you can't even talk to each other? In the Seven Sisters story, the group of stars are sisters from one skin group. Then the morning star, who's in love with the Seven Sisters, chases them across the night sky. I wonder if this sounds familiar. However, under traditional law, the man pursuing the sisters is not allowed to chase them. He's not enabled. He's the wrong group. And he's forbidden to take one as his wife. So the Seven Sisters are running away from this man who has forbidden lust. And they travel across the land, and from a steep hill, they launch themselves into the sky in an attempt to escape. But the man follows the sisters into the sky, traveling in the form of a star seen in the Orion's Belt star cluster. So every night the Seven Sisters launch themselves from Earth into the night sky, and every night this man follows them across the sky, almost exactly the same as Orion chasing the Pleiades across the sky. In the Western Desert region, Aboriginal tribes from the Northern Territories call the Seven Sisters the Yungamurra Water Girls. The sisters are regarded as the beholders of beauty and possess the magic of love. Their father, who they called Dunya, fell in love with them and was transformed into a crocodile to stop him chasing them. The Aborigines also believe that the stars wear a crystal-covered coat, which explains why they shine so brightly. In the Western Desert region and cultural bloc, they are said to be seven sisters fleeing from the unwelcome attentions of a man represented by some of the stars in Orion. In these stories, the man is called Niru or Nirunya, and the Seven Sisters story songline is known as Kunkarankopa. You would have heard before the land Mount Burnett is on is traditionally that of the Wurundjeri people. And there is a legend of the Wurundjeri that they have that the Pleiades are the fire of seven Kurragurk sisters. These women were the first to know fire making, and each carried live coals on the end of their digging sticks. They refused to share these coals with anybody and were ultimately tricked into giving up the secret by Crow, who brought fire to mankind. After this, they were swept into the night sky, and their glowing fire sticks became the bright stars of the Pleiades cluster. The Wurungu people of the west coast of South Australia have a creation story embedded in a songline of great significance based on the Pleiades. In this story, the hunter, the Orion constellation, is named Tagilby. Tagilby, after falling in love with the seven sisters known as Yugaruya, chased them out of the sky onto and across the earth. So there we have it. All across Australia, many different Aboriginal cultures, each speaking their own languages, have all these stories featuring the Pleiades star cluster in the sky. And again, seven maidens feature very heavily, as in many cases does Orion the Hunter. But it's not just Australian, Aboriginal and American Indigenous cultures that have such stories. In India, the Pleiades are collectively known as Kritika, the wives of the seven wise men named the seven rishis or seven sages. In the Ukraine, the Pleiades are known as Volozhari or Babizheviji. Volozhari, the ones whose hair is glowing, or Babizheviji, female stars, refer to the female tribal deities. According to the legends, seven maids lived long ago. They used to dance the traditional round dances and sing the glorious songs to honour the gods. After their death, the gods turned them into water nymphs and, having taken them to the heavens, settled them upon the seven stars where they danced their round dances, symbolic for moving the time, to this very day. So there we have it. We've just journeyed quickly around the world, and so many different cultures all have 7 maidens up where the Pleiades are in the sky. How does this happen? How do they all have something so similar? I'll grant that I've selectively picked a little and that sometimes it's something slightly different, like a sieve or 7 men, but this 7 maidens or 7 wives or 7 girls is very, very prevalent. Why? I can't tell you, but maybe someone else coming up soon can.
Thank you, Drew. It is interesting that the different cultures saw young maidens or ladies in the sky. And now Bridget will now enlighten you about her research titled Stars in Their Eyes.
Thanks, Petra. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm very excited to present to you, not my screen, apologies, my research that I'm doing at the University of Melbourne. I'm a PhD student and I'm working with Dr. Simon Cropper, Associate Professor Dwayne Hamacher, Associate Professor Daniel Little, and Associate Professor Charles Kemp. I'm here to present my research, which is on the topic that Drew just mentioned, which is the commonality of some of these constellations and their narratives across cultures. First, I just want to quickly lend my voice to acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm on. That's the Wurundjeri people here in Melbourne. I'd like to pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and also extend that respect to any other First Nations people present. Acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and it always was and it always will be Aboriginal land. For me, it's particularly important because in my research, I am lucky enough to be able to learn so much about Aboriginal culture and knowledge in night sky knowledge, particularly in astronomy, and the wealth and the depth of that knowledge of the world's oldest living culture astounds me every time I learn something more, and I hope that we can become to appreciate a little bit more what is inside this culture and their knowledge, these systems. So as Drew mentioned, Pleiades is obviously a very common constellation, but I'm going to touch base on today is on Orion, the Hunter. And so as I mentioned, the First Nations people of Australia, the oldest living cultures on Earth, have so many stories about Orion that are very similar to what we would know him as, which is the Hunter. So he's often a male, often a young male, who is uninhibited and is not listening to the way he should behave. He attacks Pleiades, those 7 sisters, and then is often then punished and sent into the sky, killed and then sent into the sky as that punishment. What's amazing is that this story, again, is repeated over so many different cultures: Navajo, Sumerian, Babylonian, and then the ancient Greek, where Orion, the constellation's name, has come from as we know him today. And so I guess the main question for me as a researcher, and again, Drew touched on a bit, is this confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is a human tick where we tend to see information and see things in the world that confirm something we want to believe in, whether it's at the subconscious or conscious level. A good example is if you've bought a new pair of trainers, or maybe you're lucky enough to buy a new car, and then you start seeing it everywhere. And it gives you a false impression of how common actually that item is in the world. And so for me, the first thing, and for my team, the first thing was to ensure that actually this is a real thing. And yes, it is. So the research team looked at it in 2 different sections. The first image on the left there is just looking at it at the constellation level. I wasn't involved in this. This was the supervising team that was doing this research. And what this image is showing is they went and they took 27 different cultures, constellation groups and asterisms, which are like small groupings of stars, and then mapped them and then mapped how common the strength of the connection between the stars were. And so particularly these top 10 here were extremely common across all 27 cultures, with Orion being number 1, then the Pleiades onwards. But I'll just touch on those 2 for now. So the constellations are all very common, which is interesting in and of itself. And then I wanted to understand, okay, well, is the stories or the narratives about them common? And so I looked at Orion, and it's a very confusing graph, but basically I looked at across 5 different cultures and saw that, yes, he's usually a young male. He's either drunk or uninhibited, and he chases the Pleiades, and usually older man in the sky, often Aldebaran, one of the stars in Taurus, will protect the Pleiades, and then he is killed by Scorpio, and then sent into the sky as punishment. It's often also got a moral lesson associated with this this narrative or this myth, depending on the culture you're reflecting to. But it's often a story that's connected to male initiation passages in the transformation from boy to man, and it's a moral lesson around the behaviour that's expected of men in their society or culture, and that is to not attack people, to not drink too much, to not be violent, and to not to listen to your elders when they give you advice. It still doesn't answer why. So the first theory that was already out there even before I did my research is something we call common origins. And this is because most people who noticed this to date are from anthropological or astronomical backgrounds. And it had come from these sort of groups of people. And it's basically this idea that there was some ancient shared population that all humans came from, and these constellations and narratives were formed there. And then as humans migrated across the earth, we took those narratives and those constellations with us. So for me, that's particularly interesting for the First Nations in Australia. As we know, they're the oldest living culture on Earth. And the research to date is that generally they arrived in Australia 60,000+ years ago, up to 120,000 years ago. This map is showing the generally accepted out of Africa migration theory in terms of where humans started and how we migrated across the earth. And you'll see the dotted lines indicate where populations mixed a lot. They moved back and forth, either due to just migrating, or often there was a lot of warring between Europe, Asia, as we know, that massive empires that took over each other's land masses for long periods of time. What's interesting again about the First Nations here in Australia is that they migrated here, and then whilst they had interaction with other countries like Papua New Guinea and Indonesia, there was not a lot of revert back migration. And so there's not a lot of cultural transference. It's very minimal. And then again, because the First Nations here in Australia lived a relatively peaceful, diplomatic, law-abiding cultures, they shared a lot of information, but there was not a lot of warring of one culture taking over. So there's really a lot of independence and sort of a boundary around these cultures. And so their knowledge is very removed from the rest of the world. Why this is interesting is, in that case, the last time they shared a common population with the ancient Greeks, let's say, was around about 100,000 years ago. And for me, that's incredible because writing really only appeared 5,000 years ago. And so for this theory to be true, that means that for 96 to at least 100,000 years, for some cultures that still don't use writing and reading, these stories are passed on through both remembering them and then telling them really accurately. And I think as someone who can't remember where I put my keys most days, let alone what I did last week, it seemed really hard to imagine that this was the case. And we all experienced how our storytelling also is not very accurate either. We'll hear different versions of events from different people. So I was a bit dubious at this point, and there's a lot of psychological research on how poor the human memory is. However, I was blown away. I did some reading. There's a really great book called The Memory Code by Lynn Kelly, and basically it's a really deep examination of how oral cultures, particularly so like the First Nations here in Australia, they're oral based, have these memory methods that have been shown to preserve information and narratives for thousands of years. And this story here I really love, and so I'll just like share it with you. The Boonwurrung and Kurnai people from Victoria, Australia gave evidence in 1858 detailing the different landforms in Port Phillip Bay, including the path of the Yarra River. So this was the idea. They detailed where the Yarra River would run when the Port Phillip Bay actually dried out. Since then, those details have been verified by scientific mapping, so they can see that the Yarra is there underneath the bay floor. And they have estimated the bay was last dry either at the end of the last ice age, about 10,000 years ago, or possibly dried out again about 1,000 years ago. Either way, this geographical knowledge has been passed down accurately within oral tradition for thousands of years. I don't know about you, but that pretty much just changed the way I thought about the world, and certainly, again, deepened my appreciations of First Nations here in Australia and the depth of knowledge they have in their systems. So I thought maybe that was the end. I was kind of like, well, maybe that's the answer. It's just these memory methods are really good, and it was common origins theory. the problem I ran into is a constellation or in the sky called the Coalsack Nebula. And what it is it's the picture on the left here. It's a really set of dark clouds against the edge of the Milky Way. And basically there's two different groups in the world who've identified it and given it a constellation. So the middle here is from First Nations here in Australia. It's the emu in the sky. It's very important. And basically it's associated with an egg that the emu is sitting on and fleeing it, and the consequences for a couple who have left their egg. The picture on the right there is from the Tupi in Brazil, and they also have this constellation in their culture. And they have a very similar narrative, and it's Rhea in the sky. And Rhea is, again, a really big, large, flightless bird. And again, the narrative around it is around about the bird's egg and what the consequences are around the story there. So the reason this is an issue is because if you look at the migration patterns, the distance, obviously, between these two cultures, they're very far apart, obviously. There's very little evidence of overlap. And that the Tupi actually arrived in Brazil about 47,000 years after the First Nations. And they have migrated, if you can follow my diagram, they've migrated through Europe, Asia, all the way over through Russia and Alaska, down through North America, all the way to Brazil. So what we can see, though, is that the Coalsack Nebula, it actually isn't, it's got a south declination in terms of it can only be seen in southern latitudes most of the time. And what that means is that green band there is the places on Earth where you can see this constellation most of the year. The orange band is where you can see it sometimes during the year, and then the red band is where you can't see it. The issue is that the Tupi, to have migrated through all those northern hemisphere, they've migrated through the red band back over thousands of years, back through the orange band into the green band. And none of the cultures that exist in the red band or the top section of that orange band have any constellation associated with the Coalsack Nebula. So therefore, it indicates if they did migrate through that area, they would have lost that narrative, they would have lost that constellation. And as they've gone back down south again, they've independently generated it again, and it's become part of their culture. And so then what's fascinating, again, obviously, is they've independently generated it, and yet it's somehow so similar to the First Nations here in Australia. So that theory was no longer right. So I went to, well, not right, but it had elements of truth, the memory methods and the storytelling, but there's obviously something else going on. So then the theory 2 is convergent perception, and this is a bottom-up idea. This is very much from my psychology research. It's that biological and evolutionary forces have caused us to independently identify the constellations in the sky as similar and create similar narratives for them. The reason this works is because we know that the visual perception system needs to create meaningful representation of the world, and we've all experienced this where it's prone to finding patterns and faces and objects in noise. So this is very similar to if you might look at the clouds and you see a dog or a cat in it, and it's obviously not there, but our eyes are automatically trying to make sense of the world around us for us, and so sometimes it gets it a little bit wrong. But we can see how we would all do this sort of grouping and seeing the same image in the sky. We also know in terms of the narrative element, the storytelling is evolutionary adaptive and developmentally essential. So basically kids from the age of 3 can basically understand and repeat stories, even myth-structured stories. And then we also know that storytelling often has essential information that's directly beneficial to people. So there's often a lot of survival information embedded in a lot of these night sky narratives. Again, what I ran into as an issue is that we see variations in perceptions in individual due to innate differences in personality and cultural background. So I think we all maybe remember the Twitter war over the blue black dress and the gold white dress. So some researchers investigated it and basically saw that different people's brains were interpreting the scene differently and adding in context like, oh, there's a light in the background or there's some shadows. And so there's a lot of research that's also been done by my supervisor, Dr. Cropper, that says some people's personalities means they're more prone to finding faces or images and noise, like more likely to see images and clouds than other people. And so then there's a difference there in actually how we're seeing the world. The other thing is that our perception of the world is affected by our social groups. So many of you will know this illusion of the rabbit and duck. And we can generally tend to see both, but we'll preference one. If you're someone who sees the rabbit and you walk into a room where people only see the duck, you better believe that by the end, you are only going to see the duck. And it's this thing where we are so pro-social that we agree to the point that actually changes our vision sometimes. And not with this example, but certainly with other things that we tend to notice, we see that people's vision, depending on what culture they come from, that can actually affect what they actually notice in the world around them. So that theory didn't answer all the questions either. So I ended up at the theory I'm researching now, which is I've called the shared experience theory, and it kind of merges both theory 1 and theory 2. It's the idea that there's biological forces that are mixing with cultural forces to create a meaningful and shared experience of the world. And the best way I can explain this is my experience of learning about Orion when I was very little. I grew up in a Euroa and Tuggeranong country, and it's very dark there and it's alpine region, so the sky is really bright. And I remember being very young and being like, what are those 3 stars? They look like something, you know, that looks really important. So I went to one of my brothers and I said, what is that? And so one of my brothers said, oh yeah, that's the shopping trolley. And I was like, okay. Thankfully, another brother was there and he told me it was Orion. And he explained the story of Orion. And what was interesting to me is that the Orion story was so much stickier. It had more meaning. It had a richer sort of story to it. And it was a character that I could identify with. And so that's the story that stayed with me. And it affected what I saw. So now I just see Orion every time, right, rather than the shopping trolley. Oh yeah, and the addition was that it was Orion who's fallen over. So how this works is basically this theory connects individual, group, and cultural sense-making processes to construct and maintain a shared sense of reality, rather than us innately forming a common reality. So on the red box on the left is the idea of what's at the biological level. So we look up in the sky, we see some stars, and then we automatically group them together, and we automatically sort of start to see it as an object, right? Like looks like a tail, or it could be an arm. And then we get into this altered state, which is this yellow box. That's where we start to talk to other people and we create this shared sense of perception. So we might go, oh, look, I see a tail. And they're like, oh, I see an arm. And then eventually we kind of start to agree, oh, it's the tail, and it kind of looks like the tail of a scorpion. And then what happens over time is that we start to see that when this tail of the scorpion is in the sky at this point in time, we start to notice things in our environment. So potentially it's a good time to hunt fish, or potentially a good time to plant a crop. And so we start to pair the information with that character in the sky. And it makes it a lot stickier because it's in a story. And so it's much easier for us to remember. And it's really important that we continue to remember it. It then goes into this maintained box, which is this green box, and that's our cultural level. And that's where the real narrative heuristics come in with Scorpio, who kills Orion. So there's a full narrative that's formed, and that's potentially because we've noticed that Scorpio is on the opposite side of the sky to Orion. And we see that opposition as a sense of conflict. So we've interpreted it over time as, okay, Scorpio kills Orion, and that's why he disappears over the horizon at this time of year. And then to make it even stickier, and then also to connect it more closely to our culture and how we live, there's a lesson that's often embedded in that story. So the story about Scorpio killing Orion is a lesson about not being violent, or a lesson about, you know, following what your elders tell you, as I mentioned earlier. And then that green box is really what gets maintained by the First Nations memory methods over time. And then what happens is we share that with our people in our world, our groups, our small kids, and we learn this and we update our thinking around that as we hear it. So what's next? I'm currently doing research with basically using new constellations. So it's different night skies that are unfamiliar to people, and you can go in and you can draw a new constellation, and then you can create your own narrative about that constellation. And we're looking to see how common the constellations are that people draw in one night sky scene, and then how common the narratives are about the constellations that they've drawn. All right, and that's me. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I'll hand back to you, Petra.
Thank you, Bridget. That was very interesting, and maybe some of our viewers will see a constellation make their own story with a moral attached to it. And if you have thought about joining us at MBO as a member, here's a brief explanation of who we are.
Mount Bennett Observatory is a community-run astronomical society in the Dandenong Ranges. We are completely volunteer run and have over 500 members. We focus on community engagement, outreach, diversity, and helping our members to get the most out of their love of space and astronomy. The observatory was originally built by Monash University for students to do astronomical research, especially on variable stars, stars whose brightness changes over time. Over the next 2 decades, the site was expanded and upgraded, but eventually took a back seat to modern giant internet-connected observatories around the world. In 2011, our 5 founding members reached an agreement with the landowners and took over the lease and established a society. Now, we run over 80 events each year, including members' nights, public viewings, and special events. We have several special interest groups including deep sky observing, radio astronomy, astrophotography, astro arts, and young observers. In 2020, we expanded our online presence and now host regular live streaming events. We welcome all new members and love making new friends with other astronomy lovers. You will be joining a friendly community of passionate, hard-working amateurs who have a grand vision for the future of the observatory. We hope to see you up at MBO soon.
And the time has come to conclude tonight's show. Thank you all for joining us, and from all of us at MBO, we'd also like to thank the Global Learning Festival for having us on board again this year. We all hope that you have enjoyed our program tonight about multicultural astronomy. If you have, please join us again for future shows, or you can rewatch any of our past segments on Facebook and YouTube. Don't forget to hit the like or that subscribe button, or join us as a member at MBO. Good night. Take care. Until next time. Bye, everybody.